Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Kentucky Hills. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1882, the remote settlement of Harrows Hollow in the eastern hills of Carter County, Kentucky, became the center of events that would challenge the most seasoned investigators and haunt the collective memory of the region for generations to come. The landscape of Carter County in the early 1880s was one of profound isolation and rugged beauty. The rolling hills of the Appalachian foothills stretched endlessly, covered in dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine that turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold each autumn. Deep hollows carved by ancient streams created natural barriers between settlements, and the limestone bedrock beneath the soil was honeycombed with caves and underground passages that had formed over millions of years. These geological features, which would later prove significant to our narrative, were well known to the local population, who used them for storage, shelter, and occasionally for less savory purposes. Harrows Hollow itself was situated approximately 19 miles from the nearest established town of Olive Hill, accessible only by a narrow wagon track that wound treacherously through the hills and became impassable during heavy rains or winter snows. The hollow was a natural basin surrounded by steep, wooded slopes, with a cold spring creek running through its center that eventually joined Tygart Creek several miles to the north. In 1882, no more than 15 families called this isolated valley home. Their cabins and modest farms scattered along the creek bottom and lower slopes where the land could be cleared for cultivation. The Bellamy family arrived in Harrows Hollow in the spring of 1878, purchasing a substantial tract of land at the western end of the valley, where the hollow narrowed to a steep-walled ravine. Heinrich Bellamy, who anglicized his name from the German Heinrich Bellman shortly after arriving in America in 1875, was a man of considerable education for the frontier. He claimed to have been a teacher of natural philosophy and languages in Prussia before immigrating following some unspecified difficulty with authorities there. He was 42 years old when he settled in Kentucky, a tall man with penetrating dark eyes and a neatly trimmed beard that was already showing considerable gray. Those who met him in those early years recalled his formal manner of speaking, his extensive vocabulary, and his habit of carrying a leather-bound journal in which he constantly made notations about the natural world around him. His wife, Clara Bellamy, was American-born, the daughter of German immigrants who had settled in Pennsylvania. She was 15 years younger than her husband, a handsome woman with blonde hair she wore in a severe bun and pale blue eyes that neighbors described as somehow vacant or distant. She spoke little, even in the most social situations, and seemed content to remain in her husband's shadow. The couple had 4 children when they arrived in Harrows Hollow: Wilhelm, age 14, Gretchen, age 11, young Heinrich, age 8, and little Margaret, who was only 5 years old. What made the Bellamy family unusual, beyond Heinrich's education and European background, was the extensive library he had transported to this remote location. Neighbors who visited the Bellamy cabin in those first years reported seeing shelf after shelf of books in German, Latin, and English, covering subjects from botany and geology to what appeared to be ancient history and esoteric religious texts. Heinrich claimed his library was essential to continuing his children's education in the wilderness And indeed, he taught them lessons each morning, while Clara tended to the domestic work and the family's small vegetable garden. The Bellamy farm consisted of about 40 acres, but only 5 or 6 were cleared for cultivation. The family kept a small herd of goats, some chickens, and 2 dairy cows. They grew potatoes, beans, and corn, and seemed to live frugally, but adequately. Heinrich made occasional trips to Olive Hill to purchase flour, salt, and other necessities, selling modest amounts of goat cheese and medicinal herbs he gathered from the forest. By all accounts, the family was quiet, kept largely to themselves, but caused no concern among their neighbors during their first 3 years in the hollow. The first hint that something had gone wrong with the Bellamy family appeared in the late summer of 1881, though the significance of these early warning signs would only become clear in retrospect, according to diary entries later discovered belonging to Sarah Pritchard, whose family farm was situated about 2 miles east of the Bellamy property. The children stopped appearing at the occasional community gatherings held at the small church that served the hollow. The Bellamy family had never been particularly social, but the children had previously been allowed to attend Sunday services and the rare social events that brought the scattered families together. When Sarah Pritchard's husband, Thomas, encountered Heinrich Bellamy on the road in September of 1881, he inquired about the children's absence. According to Thomas Pritchard's later testimony to authorities, Heinrich responded that he had decided to intensify the children's education and could no longer spare time for such frivolous activities. Pritchard noted that Bellamy seemed more gaunt than usual, and that his clothes, while clean, appeared worn and ill-fitting, as if he had lost considerable weight. More disturbing was Bellamy's demeanor, which Pritchard described as distracted and occasionally inappropriate. At one point in their conversation, Bellamy laughed suddenly and without apparent cause, then immediately fell silent and stared at Pritchard with what the farmer later described as an expression of intense suspicion. By October of 1881, several families in the hollow had noted changes in the Bellamy household. Smoke from their chimney was observed at odd hours, sometimes burning late into the night when decent folk should be sleeping. Travelers along the rough track that passed near the Bellamy property reported hearing sounds after dark, rhythmic chanting that might have been prayers or hymns, but in a language none could identify. The bleating of goats that seemed unusually distressed, and on at least 2 occasions, what sounded like a child crying or calling out, though the sound was distant and difficult to verify. More troubling still were the physical changes observed in Clara Bellamy during her infrequent appearances. In November of 1881, she was spotted by Rachel Grimes, a midwife who traveled throughout the hollow tending to the medical needs of isolated families. Grimes later stated in a deposition dated March 1883 that she encountered Clara Bellamy gathering herbs near the creek and was startled by the woman's appearance. Clara had always been thin, but now seemed almost skeletal, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Her hair, previously so carefully maintained, hung in lank strands around her face. Most disturbing to Grimes were Clara's hands, which were stained dark with what appeared to be old blood or perhaps some type of dye. When Grimes asked after the family's health, Clara responded in a whisper that all was well, that they were engaged in important work, and that the children were thriving in their studies. The midwife noted that Clara's eyes seemed unfocused, and that she moved with a strange, stiff gait, as if her joints pained her. The winter of 1881 to 1882 was particularly severe in the Kentucky hills. Heavy snows fell in December and January, and temperatures dropped to bitter lows that killed livestock and made travel between homesteads virtually impossible for weeks at a time. During this period of enforced isolation, the families of Harrows Hollow had no contact with the Bellamys, which was not unusual given the conditions. However, when the thaw finally came in late February, and neighbors began to venture out to check on one another and share news, the Bellamy farm remained silent and apparently deserted. It was not until mid-March of 1882 that serious concern began to develop. Thomas Pritchard, making his way along the track toward Olive Hill with a wagon load of hides and rendered fat to sell, decided to stop at the Bellamy cabin to check on the family. He found the place oddly quiet. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home, but no one appeared when he called out. The goats were visible in their pen, appearing thin but alive. After several minutes of calling and receiving no response, Pritchard approached the cabin door and knocked loudly. According to Pritchard's testimony, the door was opened by young Wilhelm Bellamy, now 15 years old. Pritchard barely recognized the boy. Wilhelm had grown taller, but had lost an alarming amount of weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes deeply sunken, and his skin had a grayish pallor. More disturbing was his expression, which Pritchard described as blank and somehow inhuman, showing no recognition or emotion at all. When Pritchard asked if all was well, Wilhelm responded in a flat monotone that the family was engaged in important research and could not be disturbed. He then closed the door in Pritchard's face without another word. Deeply unsettled, Pritchard continued to Olive Hill, where he mentioned his concerns to several townspeople, including the county sheriff, Amos Harmon. Sheriff Harmon, a practical man of 50 years with extensive experience in the rough frontier county, made note of Pritchard's report, but did not consider it sufficient cause for immediate action. Families in the isolated hollows were known for their eccentricities, and unless actual crimes were reported, the sheriff was reluctant to intrude on their privacy. He did, however, promise Pritchard that he would make inquiries when next he traveled through that region. The events that would finally bring official attention to the Bellamy family began on the morning of April 15, 1882. A traveling peddler named Silas Morton, who made regular circuits through the Kentucky hills selling tools, cloth, buttons, needles, and other small goods, failed to arrive at his expected stop in Olive Hill. Morton was known for his reliability and his strict adherence to his schedule, as his customers depended on his visits for necessary supplies. When 2 days passed with no sign of Morton, concern grew among those who knew his route. Morton's circuit was well established, and several people had seen him the day before his disappearance. He had spent the night of April 13 at the Grimes homestead, about 5 miles east of Harrows Hollow. Rachel Grimes later testified that Morton had been in good health and spirits, that he had sold her family several items, and that he had departed early on the morning of April 14th with the intention of reaching Olive Hill by nightfall. His route would have taken him directly past the Bellamy farm. When Morton had not appeared by April 17th, Sheriff Harmon organized a search party. 6 men, including Thomas Pritchard and Rachel Grimes's husband John, retraced Morton's likely route. They found clear evidence of his passage along the main track, wheel ruts from his heavily laden cart visible in the soft spring earth. These tracks led directly past the turnoff to the Bellamy property and then simply vanished. The searchers examined the area carefully and made a disturbing discovery. The wheel tracks turned onto the narrow path leading to the Bellamy cabin, but there were no corresponding tracks leading back out to the main road. Sheriff Harmon decided immediate investigation was warranted, the search party, now consisting of 8 armed men, proceeded to the Bellamy cabin. It was late afternoon when they arrived, and they found the property apparently deserted. The goats were gone from their pen. The chickens were nowhere to be seen. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the cabin appeared dark and closed up. However, the door was not locked, and when Sheriff Harmon pushed it open, he found a scene that would be seared into his memory forever. The interior of the cabin was in a state of complete disarray. Furniture had been overturned. Books from Heinrich Bellamy's extensive library lay scattered across the floor, their pages torn or marked with strange symbols that appeared to have been drawn in blood. The walls were covered with similar symbols, arcane designs that none of the men recognized, arranged in complex patterns that seemed to radiate from the fireplace. The floor was stained dark in several places, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something acrid and chemical that burned the nostrils. More troubling still was what they found in the cabin's single bedroom. Clara Bellamy lay on the bed, or what remained of her. She was clearly dead, her body in an advanced state of decomposition, suggesting she had been deceased for weeks. Her hands were folded across her chest, and her face, though partially corrupted, bore an expression that Sheriff Harmon later described as one of absolute terror, frozen at the moment of death. But what made the scene particularly disturbing was the arrangement of objects around her body. Stones carved with symbols, bundles of herbs, small bones arranged in geometric patterns, and a leather journal open to a page covered with writing in what appeared to be Latin or perhaps some other ancient language. Of Heinrich Bellamy and the 4 children, there was no sign. The search party thoroughly examined the cabin and the immediate grounds, but found no trace of them. However, they did find something else that deepened the mystery. Behind the cabin, partially concealed by overgrown brush, was the entrance to a cave in the limestone hillside. The opening was narrow but passable, and the earth around it showed clear signs of recent and frequent traffic. Sheriff Harmon, though deeply reluctant to enter the cave in the failing light, decided that immediate investigation was necessary. Taking 3 of his most reliable men and several lanterns, he entered the cave while the others remained outside to guard against the family's unexpected return. What they found in that limestone passage would transform a case of suspicious disappearance into something far more disturbing. The cave extended back into the hillside for approximately 200 feet, opening into a larger chamber roughly 30 feet in diameter. The walls of this chamber were covered with more of the strange symbols seen in the cabin, but here they had been carefully carved into the stone with considerable effort over what must have been many months. In the center of the chamber was a circular area that had been cleared of all debris and marked with an elaborate design made from white stones embedded in the earth. Around this circle were arranged wooden benches, suggesting this space had been used for some form of ceremony or ritual. But what drew the immediate attention of Sheriff Harmon and his men were the objects arranged along the chamber's walls. There were piles of personal belongings, clothes, boots, a pocket watch, a woman's bonnet, a child's doll, tools, and other items that clearly did not belong to the Bellamy family. More disturbingly, in one corner of the chamber, carefully stacked, were human bones. Later, forensic examination, conducted by Dr. Everett Hayes, who was summoned from Lexington, would determine that these remains represented no fewer than 5 individuals of various ages, including at least 1 child. The bones showed signs of having been cleaned and deliberately arranged, though for what purpose could not be determined. Most disturbing of all was what was discovered in a smaller side chamber, accessible through a narrow opening at the back of the main cave. Here, in a space barely large enough for a man to stand upright, the search party found evidence of recent habitation. Blankets were spread on the ground. Empty food tins were stacked in one corner, and scratched into the cave wall in a childish hand were the words, "We cannot leave. He watches. The forest must be fed." The discovery of Clara Bellamy's body, the cave chamber with its disturbing contents, and the complete disappearance of Heinrich Bellamy and the 4 children created immediate sensation throughout Carter County and beyond. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story on April 22, 1882, under the headline, "Mystery in the Hills. Family Vanishes. Cave of Bones Discovered." The article described the known facts and speculated wildly about the possible explanations, ranging from a cult ritual gone wrong to murder and flight by Heinrich Bellamy. Sheriff Harmon expanded the search, bringing in additional men from Olive Hill and surrounding communities. They scoured the forest around the Bellamy property, examining every ravine, every cave entrance, every possible hiding place within 5 miles of the cabin. They found no trace of Heinrich or the children. However, they did make several additional disturbing discoveries that deepened the mystery, rather than resolving it. In a ravine approximately half a mile from the Bellamy cabin, searchers found the remains of Silas Morton's cart. It had been pushed over the edge of a steep drop, and the fall had shattered it into pieces. Morton's goods were scattered among the wreckage, though many items appeared to be missing, likely scavenged by wildlife or perhaps taken by whoever had pushed the cart over the edge. Of Morton himself there was no sign, though the discovery of his destroyed cart confirmed that he had indeed reached the Bellamy property and met with foul play there. Over the following weeks, as spring advanced and the forest came into full leaf, additional searches were conducted. Bloodhounds were brought in and followed various scent trails that invariably ended at creek beds or rocky outcrops where the trail was lost. Caves throughout the area were systematically explored, revealing the extensive network of limestone passages that honeycombed the hills, but no further evidence of the missing family was discovered. Dr. Everett Hayes, who had been asked by the county prosecutor to examine the physical evidence from the Bellamy cabin and cave, prepared a detailed report dated May 12, 1882. His findings raised more questions than they answered. The bones found in the cave chamber were confirmed to be human, representing at least 5 individuals of mixed age and sex. The condition of the bones suggested they had been exposed to the elements for varying periods, with some appearing relatively fresh, while others showed signs of considerable age. Most disturbing was Dr. Hayes's observation that many of the bones showed marks consistent with deliberate defleshing, as if the tissue had been carefully removed with sharp instruments. The journal found, beside Clara Bellamy's body, was examined by Professor Marcus Whitmore, a scholar of ancient languages from the University of Kentucky. His report, dated June 3, 1882, indicated that the journal contained passages in Latin, Greek, and what appeared to be corrupted versions of ancient Germanic and Slavic languages. The content, as far as Professor Whitmore could determine, dealt with obscure religious and philosophical concepts related to blood sacrifice, the propitiation of earth spirits, and the maintenance of balance between civilization and wilderness. One passage, translated by Whitmore, was particularly chilling. "The forest is eternal and must be sustained with that which civilization produces. The old ones beneath the hills demand the wanderer, the stranger, the one who does not belong. Only through this offering can the faithful be preserved. Perhaps most inexplicable was the condition of Clara Bellamy's body. Dr. Hayes's autopsy, conducted despite the advanced decomposition, revealed no obvious cause of death. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of poisoning that could be determined given the body's condition, no indication of disease. Hayes concluded that she had died approximately 4 to 6 weeks before her body was discovered, placing her death in early to mid-March of 1882. Yet there was no explanation for why her body had been left in the cabin, carefully arranged but not buried, while the rest of the family disappeared. The investigation into the Bellamy family continued throughout the summer of 1882, but produced no significant new evidence. Sheriff Harmon, despite his best efforts, was forced to conclude that Heinrich Bellamy and his 4 children had either perished in the extensive cave system beneath the hills, their bodies hidden in some undiscovered passage, or had somehow managed to flee the region entirely, though how they could have done so without being observed remained unexplained. The case was never officially closed, but active investigation ceased by autumn of that year. However, the story of the Bellamy family did not end with the termination of the official investigation. In October of 1882, a family traveling through the region on their way to relatives in Virginia reported a disturbing encounter. They had made camp for the night in a clearing several miles from Harrows Hollow, when their children claimed to have seen other children watching them from the forest edge. The travelers investigated but found no one, though they did find what appeared to be a crude shelter made of branches and leaves, suggesting someone had been living in the forest. Inside this shelter were several items that were later identified as having belonged to the Bellamy children. A child's primer with Wilhelm Bellamy's name written inside, a small wooden horse that Thomas Pritchard remembered seeing young Heinrich playing with, and a girl's hair ribbon that might have belonged to either Gretchen or Margaret. In November of 1882, a hunter named Jacob Thornton reported finding what he believed to be a fresh grave in the forest about 3 miles from the Bellamy cabin. Sheriff Harmon and several deputies investigated and exhumed the grave, finding the body of a man who matched Silas Morton's description. The body had been buried with some care and had been covered with stones to prevent animals from disturbing it. However, examination revealed disturbing details. Morton had died from a severe blow to the back of the head, consistent with murder. But more troubling was the condition of the body. Dr. Hayes, called in once again, reported that significant portions of tissue were missing from the corpse, removed with what appeared to be careful cuts, rather than the tearing that would be expected from animal predation. The doctor could not provide a definitive explanation for these missing tissues, but privately expressed to Sheriff Harmon his opinion that they had been deliberately removed by human hands, though for what purpose he dared not speculate. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was again harsh, and during those long months the remaining families of Harrows Hollow huddled in their cabins and spoke in whispers of the Bellamy family and the evil that had come to their valley. Several families, deeply unsettled by the events, abandoned their homesteads and moved to more populated areas. The Bellamy cabin stood empty, and though it contained furniture and goods that could have been scavenged, no one would approach it. The local wisdom held that the place was cursed, that something unnatural had transpired there, and that those who disturbed it would invite similar doom upon themselves. It was not until the spring of 1883 that the next significant development occurred. In March of that year, a young girl estimated to be about 7 years old was found wandering alone on the road outside Olive Hill. She was in a severely malnourished and disturbed state, unable or unwilling to speak, and appeared terrified of any adult who approached her. She was taken into the care of Rachel Grimes, who slowly nursed her back to physical health, though the child's mental state remained fragile. After several weeks, the girl finally spoke, revealing that her name was Margaret Bellamy. She was the youngest of the Bellamy children, now aged 6 when she was found, though her ordeal had left her appearing even younger and far more damaged than her years would suggest. Through patient and gentle questioning, Rachel Grimes and Sheriff Harmon were able to extract a fragmentary and often contradictory account of what had happened to the Bellamy family after Clara's death. According to Margaret's testimony, recorded in a document dated April 15, 1883, her father had changed in the months before her mother died. He had become obsessed with his books and with what he called the old knowledge. He spent long hours in the cave, carving symbols on the walls and conducting what he described as necessary ceremonies. He taught these ceremonies to the older children, Wilhelm and Gretchen, who seemed to accept and embrace his teachings. Young Heinrich was more resistant, and Margaret remembered her father becoming angry with the boy, though she could not clearly describe what that anger entailed. Her mother, Margaret said, had been frightened and wanted to leave, but her father would not permit it. He told Clara that they were engaged in essential work, that they had been chosen to maintain the balance, and that to abandon their duty would result in terrible consequences for them all. Margaret remembered her mother crying often and remembered her father giving her mother special tea to drink that made her sleep for long periods. When the peddler came, Margaret said, her father and Wilhelm had killed him. She had not witnessed the act itself, but she had seen them dragging the body toward the cave. She remembered her father saying that the forest must be fed, that the old ones demanded offering, and that strangers who came to their land were sent by Providence to fulfill this need. Her mother had protested, and Margaret believed, though she could not clearly remember, that her mother had tried to run away or to seek help. Shortly after this, her mother had died. Margaret did not know how her mother died, only that one morning she found her mother cold and still in the bed, with her father sitting beside her, weeping and speaking in a language Margaret did not understand. After her mother's death, Margaret's account became even more fragmentary and confused. She remembered living in the cave for a period of time. She remembered her father performing ceremonies that involved chanting, the burning of herbs, and the arrangement of bones in specific patterns. She remembered that Wilhelm and Gretchen participated in these ceremonies willingly, even eagerly, but that young Heinrich resisted and was punished for his resistance. She could not or would not describe the nature of these punishments. She remembered the night they fled the cabin, though she could not explain why they fled or what precipitated their departure. Her father had led them deep into the forest, avoiding all roads and paths. They had lived in crude shelters, moving frequently, eating roots and berries, and whatever small animals Wilhelm could trap. Her father spoke constantly of the watching spirits, of the need to complete the work, of the price that must be paid for their preservation. At some point, Margarete became separated from her family. She believed they had left her behind deliberately, though whether this was abandonment or an attempt to save her from whatever fate her father envisioned for them, she could not say. She had wandered alone in the forest for days or perhaps weeks, surviving on whatever she could find until finally, staggering onto the road, where she was discovered. Margaret's testimony, though disturbing, provided no definitive answers about the fate of her father and siblings. Sheriff Harmon organized another extensive search of the forest based on her vague descriptions of the areas where they had camped, but no trace of Heinrich Bellamy, Wilhelm, Gretchen, or young Heinrich was ever found. The assumption among investigators was that they had perished in the wilderness, either from starvation, exposure, or some misadventure in the extensive cave systems. However, no bodies were ever recovered, and the question of their ultimate fate remained open. Margaret Bellamy was eventually placed with a family in Lexington, far from the hills of Carter County. She never fully recovered from her ordeal, remaining withdrawn and troubled throughout her life. She died in 1901 at the age of 24 from pneumonia, never having married or established an independent life. Her foster family reported that she frequently suffered from nightmares and would sometimes wake screaming about the forest and the ones who waited beneath the hills. The case of the Bellamy family might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as a tragic example of frontier madness and isolation, except for several disturbing developments that occurred in subsequent years. In 1887, a family of 4 traveling through Carter County on their way to relatives in Virginia disappeared without trace. Their abandoned wagon was found on a road approximately 8 miles from the old Bellamy property. Inside the wagon were all their possessions, but the family themselves were never seen again. Despite extensive searches, no sign of them was discovered. In 1893, a hermit who had been living in the hills reported finding a cave that contained human bones and evidence of habitation. When authorities investigated, they discovered a chamber remarkably similar to the one found on the Bellamy property, complete with carved symbols on the walls and carefully arranged bones representing multiple individuals. This cave was located nearly 15 miles from the Bellamy farm, but the similarities were too striking to be coincidental. Most disturbing was an incident that occurred in 1899. A young man named Thomas Brennan, who had recently moved to Carter County from Ohio, disappeared while hunting in the hills. Search parties found no trace of him. However, several weeks after his disappearance, a group of children playing near the entrance to one of the many caves in the region reported seeing a man who matched Brennan's description standing at the cave mouth. According to their account, the man was emaciated and oddly dressed in what appeared to be animal skins. When the children called out to him, he retreated into the cave, and when adults arrived to investigate, they found no sign of anyone. However, scratched on the wall near the cave entrance were words that sent chills through those who saw them. The forest must be fed. The old ones are hungry. In 1909, Professor Edmund Cartwright of the University of Kentucky undertook a comprehensive study of disappearances in the Carter County region over the previous 30 years. His research, published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1910, documented 23 cases of unexplained disappearances in the area, a rate significantly higher than would be expected for a region of that population density. Cartwright noted that many of these disappearances occurred within a roughly circular area of approximately 40 square miles, with the old Bellamy property near its center. He also documented reports from various individuals over the years who claimed to have seen figures moving in the forest, particularly near cave entrances. Figures that appeared human, but moved in strange, unnatural ways. Professor Cartwright's study also included extensive research into the history of the region before European settlement. He discovered accounts from early explorers and settlers that suggested the indigenous peoples who had originally inhabited these hills, primarily Shawnee and Cherokee, had considered certain areas taboo and refused to enter them. One account, recorded by a missionary in 1796, described a Delaware guide who refused to enter a particular valley, stating that it belonged to the old ones who lived beneath the hills and demanded tribute from those who walked above. Perhaps most fascinating was Cartwright's examination of Heinrich Bellamy's journal, which had been preserved in the county records. Working with experts in ancient languages and esoteric religious texts, Cartwright concluded that Bellamy had been influenced by a mixture of Germanic pagan traditions, medieval alchemy, and what appeared to be garbled accounts of pre-Christian sacrifice cults. One entry, dated January 12, 1882, approximately 2 months before Clara Bellamy's death, was particularly illuminating. I have finally understood the truth that civilized man refuses to acknowledge. The wilderness is not empty of divinity. It contains forces as old as the earth itself, forces that sustained our ancestors before the coming of Christ, forces that demand recognition and sustenance. The Aboriginal peoples understood this. They made offerings. They maintained the balance. When we pushed them from these lands, we assumed responsibility for that which they left behind. The wanderer, the stranger, the one with no ties to the land, these are the appropriate offerings. Through their sacrifice, the rooted are preserved. This is not evil. This is ecology. This is the ancient contract between settled peoples and the eternal wilderness. This passage, and others like it in the journal, suggested that Heinrich Bellamy had constructed an elaborate philosophical and pseudo-religious framework to justify what was essentially serial murder. Whether he genuinely believed in the supernatural entities he claimed to be appeasing, or whether the entire system was a rationalization for homicidal impulses, remained a matter of debate among those who studied the case. Professor Cartwright's research also uncovered a disturbing pattern regarding the Bellamy family's history before they arrived in Kentucky. Heinrich Bellamy's claim to have been a teacher in Prussia proved difficult to verify, but Cartwright was able to trace the family's movements through immigration records and newspaper accounts. The Bellamys had lived briefly in Pennsylvania, where Heinrich had indeed worked as a teacher in a German community school. However, they had left that position abruptly in late 1877, following the disappearance of a traveling tinker who had last been seen in the area of the school. No charges had been filed, and no evidence linked Bellamy to the disappearance, but the timing was suggestive. Similarly, Cartwright found that during the Bellamy's brief residence in Ohio in early 1878, before they moved to Kentucky, 2 separate incidents of missing travelers had occurred within 10 miles of where the family was living. Again, no evidence directly connected Heinrich Bellamy to these disappearances, but the pattern was troubling. Cartwright speculated that Bellamy's obsession with what he called the old ways and his belief in the necessity of wilderness sacrifice might have developed years before he settled in Harrows Hollow, and that the isolated location in the Kentucky hills had simply provided him with the privacy and opportunity to act on these beliefs more openly. The Bellamy cabin itself stood abandoned until 1912, when it was finally destroyed by fire. The circumstances of the fire were never determined, though some locals believed it had been deliberately set by residents who felt the structure was a blight on the community and a dangerous attraction for the morbidly curious. The cave chamber on the Bellamy property was sealed with dynamite in 1915 by county authorities who felt it posed a safety hazard and wished to discourage further curiosity seekers. In 1924, a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal named Margaret Ashford undertook her own investigation into the Bellamy case as part of a series on unsolved mysteries of Kentucky. Her article, published on October 31st, 1924, brought renewed attention to the case and included interviews with several elderly residents of Carter County who had been young adults during the events of 1882. These interviews revealed details that had not been widely reported at the time. John Grimes, son of Rachel and John Grimes, recalled that in the months before the discovery of the Bellamy atrocities, his family and others had noticed that certain travelers who should have passed through the area seemed to have vanished. In addition to Silas Morton, there had been an itinerant preacher in February, a land surveyor in late 1881, and a woman traveling alone in December of 1881 who had been seeking domestic work. All of these individuals had last been seen heading in the direction that would take them past the Bellamy property. At the time, their disappearances had not been connected, as travelers frequently changed their plans or took alternative routes. Only in retrospect did the pattern become clear. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony of Sarah Pritchard, who by 1912 was an elderly widow living with her daughter's family. She told Margaret Ashford that in the autumn of 1881, several months before the official investigation began, she had taken a shortcut through the forest that brought her near the Bellamy property. It was late afternoon, and she had heard sounds coming from the direction of the cave entrance, which was not visible from her position, but which she knew to be nearby. The sounds, she said, were of chanting in a foreign tongue and of what might have been singing or perhaps crying. She could not be certain. Underlying these human sounds was another sound, something she described as similar to wind rushing through a narrow passage, though the air was still that day. She had been frightened and had hurried away without investigating further. She told her husband about the incident, but they had decided it was not their business to interfere with whatever strange religious practices the foreign family might be conducting. Margaret Ashford's article also included an interview with Dr. Everett Hayes, who by 1924 was retired but still possessed of clear memories of his examination of the evidence from the Bellamy case. Hayes reiterated his professional findings, but also shared his personal opinion that the case represented something beyond ordinary criminal behavior. The systematic nature of the cave chamber, the careful preparation of the bones, the elaborate symbol system, all of these suggested a level of organization and purpose that went beyond spontaneous violence or simple madness. Hayes believed that Heinrich Bellamy had been enacting a deliberate ritual system, one that he had developed over years, and that he genuinely believed was necessary and justified. More disturbing was Hayes's revelation that during his examination of the bones found in the cave chamber, he had discovered evidence that some of them had been modified after death. Notches had been carefully carved into certain bones, and one skull had been trepanned, a hole drilled into the cranium, though whether this had been done while the victim was alive or after death could not be determined. These details had been omitted from his official report at the request of the prosecutor, who felt they would inflame public opinion to no useful purpose. Hayes had agreed at the time, but by 1924 felt that the complete truth should be made known. The renewed attention to the Bellamy case in the 1920s led to several amateur investigations and considerable speculation. Some researchers attempted to connect Heinrich Bellamy to various European occult movements of the 19th century, though no definitive links were ever established. Others focused on the geological features of the region, noting that the extensive cave systems and the unusual concentration of limestone springs might have contributed to a belief among earlier inhabitants that the area possessed supernatural significance. In 1931, the anthropologist Dr. Harold Westmore published a book titled Dark Hollows, Folklore and Reality in the Kentucky Hills, which included an extensive chapter on the Bellamy case. Westmore had conducted interviews with elderly residents of the region and had collected numerous stories about the old Bellamy property and the surrounding forest. Many of these stories had the character of folklore or legend, but Westmore believed they contained kernels of truth that had been embellished over time. Several individuals reported having seen figures in the forest near the old Bellamy property, figures that moved strangely and avoided contact with humans. Others reported finding evidence of campsites or crude shelters deep in the forest, always near cave entrances, suggesting that someone or something continued to inhabit the region. Westmore collected dozens of accounts of strange sounds heard in the forest, chanting, singing, crying, and the odd rushing wind sound that Sarah Pritchard had described decades earlier. Most intriguing were accounts from two separate individuals who claimed to have encountered Wilhelm Bellamy years after the family's disappearance. The first account, dated to approximately 1895, came from a hunter who claimed to have seen a wild man in the forest, a tall, emaciated figure with long matted hair and beard, dressed in animal skins, who fled when approached. The hunter claimed the man had dropped a leather pouch, which when examined was found to contain several small carved bones and a badly degraded book written in German. The hunter, frightened by the encounter, had left the pouch where he found it and never returned to that part of the forest. The second account was even more disturbing. In 1902, a group of young men exploring the caves near Harrows Hollow claimed to have encountered a man living in one of the deeper chambers. The man had attacked them with surprising ferocity, wielding a crude club, and they had fled in panic. One of the young men claimed to have gotten a clear look at the attacker's face and insisted it was Wilhelm Bellamy, whom he remembered from childhood. By 1902, Wilhelm would have been approximately 35 years old. The young man's companions were skeptical, believing the attacker was simply a hermit or vagrant, but the witness remained convinced of what he had seen. Dr. Westmore was careful to note that these accounts could not be verified and might represent nothing more than folklore and misidentification. However, he argued that they suggested a persistent belief among the local population that something connected to the Bellamy family continued to exist in the hills. Whether that something was surviving family members living as hermits or simply the psychological legacy of the original crimes. The question of what became of Heinrich Bellamy, Wilhelm, Gretchen, and young Heinrich has never been definitively answered. The most rational explanation is that they perished in the wilderness shortly after their flight from the cabin, succumbing to exposure, starvation, or accident in the extensive cave systems. The fact that no bodies were ever found is not particularly surprising given the rugged terrain and the thousands of unexplored caves and ravines where remains could lie hidden indefinitely. However, several facts complicate this straightforward explanation. First, the continuing pattern of disappearances in the region, while not conclusive, suggests that something beyond mere accident or natural predation has been at work. Second, the multiple reported sightings of figures in the forest and of occupied caves, while often dismissed as folklore or misidentification, are numerous enough to warrant consideration. Third, the discovery of the second ritual cave in 1893 11 years after the Bellamy family's disappearance, suggests that either the family survived for many years or that Heinrich Bellamy's beliefs and practices had influenced or been adopted by others. One theory, proposed by several researchers over the years, is that Heinrich Bellamy had accomplices or followers who were never identified. Perhaps others in the region shared his beliefs or were seduced by his teachings. The ritual cave discovered in 1893 could have been the work of these unknown individuals, continuing the practices that Bellamy had established. This would explain the ongoing disappearances and the various reports of strange activities in the forest. However, no evidence has ever been found to support the existence of such a cult, and the isolated nature of the region makes it seem unlikely that Bellamy could have recruited followers without detection. Another theory focuses on the children, particularly Wilhelm. If the family did survive in the wilderness for a period of time, Wilhelm would have been the most capable of adapting to such an existence. Margaret's testimony indicated that Wilhelm had fully embraced his father's teachings and participated willingly in his activities. It is conceivable that Wilhelm survived his father's death and continued to live in the forest, perhaps even continuing the practices his father had taught him. The reported sighting in 1902 would have placed Wilhelm at the right age to match the description of the wild man living in the cave. A more disturbing possibility, one that has been raised but rarely discussed in serious academic contexts, is that the family discovered something in the caves, something that profoundly affected their psychology and behavior. The extensive limestone cave systems of the region are known to contain unusual geological features, underground streams, chambers of remarkable size, and deposits of minerals. Some researchers have speculated that exposure to certain minerals or gases in the confined cave environment could have produced psychological effects ranging from hallucinations to more profound behavioral changes. This would not excuse Heinrich Bellamy's crimes, but it might explain the apparent transformation of the entire family and the intensity of their shared delusion. The legend of the Bellamy family has become part of the folklore of Carter County. The old Bellamy property, though the cabin is long gone and the cave is sealed, is still known and generally avoided by locals. Parents warn their children away from that part of the forest, and hunters tend to give the area a wide berth. Whether this avoidance is based on genuine fear, superstition, or simply respect for the site of terrible crimes is difficult to determine. In 1958, a team from the University of Kentucky conducted an archaeological survey of the sealed Bellamy Cave as part of a broader study of historical sites in eastern Kentucky. The cave entrance was partially reopened for the survey, and the chamber was documented with photographs and detailed measurements. The team confirmed the presence of the carved symbols on the walls and recovered several artifacts that had been missed in the original 1882 investigation, including stone tools, fragments of pottery, and several small carved figurines of indeterminate age. Analysis of these items raised more questions than it answered. Some of the artifacts appeared to be contemporary with the Bellamy occupation, but others seemed much older, possibly dating to the prehistoric period when indigenous peoples inhabited the region. Most intriguing was the discovery of what appeared to be a natural passage leading deeper into the hillside from the main chamber. This passage, which had been concealed behind a rockfall that may have been deliberately arranged, led to a second chamber approximately 70 feet below the first. This lower chamber contained evidence of occupation, including fire pits, midden deposits, and what appeared to be sleeping areas, but the artifacts recovered suggested the occupation dated to the 18th or early 19th century, long before the Bellamy family arrived in the region. Carbon dating of organic materials from the chamber provided dates ranging from 1750 to 1820, suggesting multiple periods of use. The existence of this lower chamber, unknown during the original investigation, raised the possibility that Heinrich Bellamy had not created the ritual system found in the cave, but had rather discovered and adopted practices that were already present, left by earlier occupants whose identity and purpose remain unknown. This finding lent some credence to Bellamy's own writings, which suggested he believed he was continuing ancient traditions rather than inventing new ones. The archaeological team also made a disturbing discovery in the lower chamber. Human remains consisting of fragmentary bones from at least 3 individuals were found in a small alcove. Carbon dating indicated these remains dated to approximately 1800 to 1820, placing them roughly 60 years before the Bellamy occupation. The bones showed signs of deliberate defleshing and modification similar to those found in the bones from the Bellamy era, suggesting that whatever ritual practices Heinrich Bellamy had engaged in had precedence in the site's earlier history. Following this 1958 investigation, the cave was again sealed, this time with concrete, and the site was declared off-limits to the public for safety and preservation reasons. The findings from the survey were published in a technical report that received limited distribution and have remained largely unknown outside academic circles. In the decades since, the Bellamy case has occasionally resurfaced in popular culture. True crime books, documentary programs, and internet forums devoted to unsolved mysteries have all featured the story, though often with significant embellishment and speculation that goes well beyond the documented facts. The case has been cited as evidence of everything from satanic cults to cannibalism to prehistoric supernatural survivals, though serious researchers have found no support for the more extreme claims. What remains indisputable is that Heinrich Bellamy and his family were responsible for multiple murders in 1881 and 1882, that they engaged in elaborate ritual practices involving human remains, and that at least 3 members of the family disappeared into the Kentucky wilderness, never to be definitively found. The question of what drove Heinrich Bellamy to his crimes, whether he was acting on delusional beliefs, participating in some unknown cultural or religious tradition, or simply rationalizing violent impulses with elaborate pseudo-philosophical justifications, remains a matter of interpretation. The broader question of the disappearances that continued in the region after 1882, and whether any of these can be conclusively linked to surviving members of the Bellamy family or to others influenced by their practices, remains open. The statistical evidence suggests an unusual concentration of disappearances in the region over several decades, but establishing causation or connection beyond coincidence has proved impossible. As of the present day, the Kentucky hills where these events transpired remain sparsely populated and heavily forested. The cave systems continue to be explored by speleologists, though the original Bellamy cave remains sealed. Occasional hikers and hunters still report unusual experiences in the forest. Figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, sounds that seem to have no natural source, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Whether these experiences reflect genuine anomalies, the power of suggestion influenced by knowledge of the region's dark history, or simply the natural tendency of humans to find patterns and meaning in random events, each person must decide for themselves. The case of the Bellamy family stands as a reminder that the wilderness on the edges of civilization has always harbored secrets, and that the human capacity for violence and delusion knows no bounds of time or place. It raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of belief, the vulnerability of isolated communities to charismatic individuals with aberrant ideas, and the possibility that some mysteries are never fully solved. The forest, after all, keeps its secrets well, and the hills of eastern Kentucky have remained largely silent about what truly transpired in that dark hollow more than 140 years ago. To this day, researchers continue to debate the Bellamy case, with new theories emerging periodically as scholars approach the evidence from different perspectives. Psychological historians have attempted to analyze Heinrich Bellamy's journal entries for insights into his mental state. Anthropologists have compared his ritual practices to similar systems found in various cultures throughout history. Sociologists have examined the case as an example of how isolation and marginalization can contribute to the development of deviant belief systems. But despite all this scholarly attention, the core mysteries remain unresolved, and the fate of Heinrich Bellamy and his children continues to elude definitive explanation. The story of the Bellamy family who fed the forest with strangers stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in Kentucky history, a dark tale of murder, madness, and mystery that continues to fascinate and horrify more than a century after the events transpired. It serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural entities, but ordinary human beings transformed by isolation, belief, and the capacity for violence that lurks within us all.